A judge gets terrified after seeing a prisoner's necklace. It belonged to his daughter. The courtroom freezes as the necklace glints in the light, a haunting reminder of the night she vanished. How did this man, covered in tattoos and charged with violence, end up with something so personal? The judge's hands tremble, his mind racing through years of buried grief. But the prisoner refuses to explain, leaving only cryptic hints that her death wasn't an accident. As the tension builds, one question burns brighter than the rest. What dark secrets tie this stranger to his daughter's tragic fate? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 7A, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Harold Calloway sat straight-backed on the bench, his silver hair neatly combed, his black robes pressed and pristine. His weathered hands rested on the smooth surface before him, one holding a well-worn gavel that had delivered countless verdicts over his 30-year career. "Next case," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority but lacking any warmth. Bailiff Michael Thompson, a stocky man with kind eyes, led another defendant to stand before the bench. "Your Honor, we have Mr. Jenkins for a parking violation," Court Clerk Serena Davis stated, her efficient tone matching the methodical pace of the morning's proceedings. Judge Calloway's face remained impassive as he reviewed the file before him. His steel-gray eyes moved systematically across each line, processing information with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The defendant shifted nervously, but Calloway showed no recognition of the man's discomfort. "Mr. Jenkins, this is your third violation this month," Calloway stated flatly. "The fine will be doubled. Next case." The morning continued in this fashion, a steady stream of minor offenses, each handled with the same detached efficiency. The judge's reputation for strict adherence to the law was well known throughout the county. While some called him harsh, none could deny his fairness or question his dedication to justice. As the last case concluded, Calloway retired to his chambers. The room was a testament to his professional achievements, walls lined with framed certificates, commendations, and law school diplomas. Yet there were no family photos, no personal touches that might hint at a life beyond these walls. Serena Davis appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of files. "Judge Calloway, I wanted to remind you that next week marks your 30th year on the bench," she ventured with a small smile. "Some of us were thinking—" "Thank you, Ms. Davis," Calloway interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "The files can go on my desk." Serena's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor as she placed the documents down. The silence in the room grew heavy with unspoken words, years of similar attempted conversations hanging in the air between them. As the day drew to a close, Calloway gathered his belongings with mechanical precision. His leather briefcase, like everything else in his life, was organized with military attention to detail. The courthouse halls had grown quiet, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors as he made his way toward the exit. Near the main entrance, he passed a bronze plaque that always seemed to catch the last rays of sunset. "The Emily Calloway Memorial Scholarship Fund," it read, "dedicated to supporting future advocates for justice." His steps slowed as they did every evening, but he didn't stop completely. The muscles in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the storm of emotions he refused to acknowledge. His daughter's smile, forever frozen in his memory, threatened to breach the carefully constructed walls of his composure. But like every other day for the past 5 years, he pushed the feelings down, straightened his shoulders, and continued walking. The evening light cast his shadow long across the courthouse steps, a solitary figure, respected by many but truly known by none, carrying the weight of unspoken grief in every measured step. The next morning brought another parade of cases before Judge Calloway's bench. The familiar routine of justice continued until a case that would shatter his carefully maintained composure. "Docket number 2347, the State versus Jack Riker," Serena Davis announced, her voice clear and professional. "Charges of assault in the second degree." Bailiff Thompson led in the defendant, a man whose appearance commanded attention despite his shackles. Jack Riker stood tall, his muscular arms covered in intricate tattoos that told stories of a hard life on the streets. His jaw was set in defiance, dark eyes scanning the courtroom with the wariness of a caged animal. Judge Calloway barely glanced up from his papers, maintaining his usual detachment. "Proceed with the charges," he instructed, his voice carrying its characteristic stern authority. Linda March, the prosecuting attorney, rose from her seat. Her tailored suit and precise movements matched the methodical presentation of her case. "Your Honor, on the night of March 15th, the defendant engaged in a violent altercation outside the Blue Door Bar. The victim suffered multiple contusions and a broken nose. Security camera footage clearly shows Mr. Riker initiating the confrontation." Defense attorney Aaron Price stood next, his younger face earnest as he addressed the bench. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the altercation, there are mitigating circumstances. Mr. Riker was defending a young woman who was being harassed. His actions, while excessive, came from a place of—" "Objection, Your Honor," March interrupted. "The defendant's alleged motivations are irrelevant to the charges at hand." "Sustained," Calloway responded automatically, his eyes still fixed on the documents before him. "Mr. Price, please stick to the facts of the case." As Price continued his defense, Calloway finally looked up to study the defendant. It was then that something caught his eye, a flash of gold against Riker's prison jumpsuit. The judge's hand froze mid-motion, his pen hovering above the legal pad. Around Jack Riker's neck hung a delicate gold locket, partially hidden beneath his collar. Its distinctive oval shape and the small engraved flower pattern were unmistakable. Calloway's mind flashed back to a Christmas morning 15 years ago, when he had given that very locket to Emily. She had worn it every day until— His hand trembled slightly as he set down his pen. That locket had been missing from the accident scene. The police had never found it among Emily's belongings, and he had always assumed it had been lost in the crash. Serena Davis noticed the change in the judge's demeanor. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when something was amiss. The slight shake in his usually steady hands, the sudden tension in his shoulders. These were unprecedented breaks in his carefully maintained facade. "Your Honor?" Price's voice cut through Calloway's thoughts, bringing him back to the present moment. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning," Calloway announced abruptly, his voice rougher than usual. "Mr. Riker will remain in custody." As Bailiff Thompson led Jack Riker away, Calloway's eyes remained fixed on the locket. Questions he had buried years ago began to surface. The official report had ruled Emily's death an accident, a tragic car crash on a rainy night. But that locket? That locket shouldn't be around the neck of a street fighter with a criminal record. He sat motionless at the bench long after the courtroom had emptied, his mind racing with possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider before. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, heavier than his judicial robes. As soon as the last echoes of footsteps faded from his courtroom, Harold Calloway reached for his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number for Gerald Hawkins, the prison liaison officer. The phone rang 3 times before Hawkins's gruff voice answered. "Gerald, this is Judge Calloway. I need to arrange an immediate transfer for a defendant." Harold's voice was steady, masking the turbulent emotions beneath his judicial demeanor. "Jack Riker. He needs to be moved to the Monroe Street facility." There was a pause on the other end. "That's unusual, Your Honor, especially coming directly from a judge." "I understand, Gerald, but there are special circumstances that require closer monitoring." Harold gripped the phone tighter. "I trust you can expedite this?" Hawkins cleared his throat. "Well, given your reputation, I'll see what I can do. But I hope you know what you're doing, Judge." After ending the call, Harold remained in his chambers as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, his eyes fixed on a silver-framed photograph he usually kept turned away. Emily smiled back at him, her graduation cap slightly askew, that same gold locket gleaming at her throat. The memories of that terrible night flooded back. The rain-slicked roads, the police at his door, the funeral where he'd stood rigid and dry-eyed while others wept. He'd thrown himself into his work afterward, hiding behind the law's strict procedures and protocols. Now, staring at Emily's photograph, the weight of all he'd left unsaid pressed down on him. Harold knew that investigating a defendant personally violated every principle of judicial conduct he'd upheld throughout his career. The ethical boundaries were clear. Judges remained impartial, distant from the cases before them. But the sight of that locket had cracked something open inside him, something that couldn't be resealed by protocol or procedure. The next morning, a memo arrived confirming Riker's transfer for that afternoon. Harold stood at his chamber window, watching the courthouse parking lot below. At precisely 2 o'clock, Bailiff Thompson appeared with Riker in custody. The prisoner's orange jumpsuit was bright against the gray pavement as Thompson guided him toward the waiting transport van. Even from this distance, Harold could see the gold chain around Riker's neck catch the sunlight. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. After 15 years of believing he knew exactly what happened to his daughter, this small piece of metal had shattered his certainty. He watched the van pull away, his jaw set with determination. Whatever it took, he would discover how Jack Riker had come to possess Emily's locket. The courthouse archive room lay in the basement, a maze of metal shelving and cardboard boxes stretching into dim fluorescent-lit corners. Harold hadn't visited this place in years, yet the musty paper smell brought back memories of his early days as a young attorney. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Judge Calloway? Jonathan Pierce, the archive clerk, peered at him through thick glasses. This is unexpected. What can I help you find? Harold cleared his throat. I need files from 15 years ago, the Emily Calloway case. Jonathan's expression softened with recognition. Everyone in the courthouse knew about the judge's daughter. Of course, Your Honor. Give me a few minutes. While Jonathan disappeared between the towering shelves, Harold stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. The gentle whir of ancient heating ducts filled the silence. After what seemed like an eternity, Jonathan returned, pushing a cart loaded with 3 dusty boxes. Here they are, sir. Everything we have on file. Jonathan hesitated. Would you like me to help you set up in the reading room? No, thank you. Harold's voice was clipped, professional. I'll manage. Once alone with the boxes, Harold's composed facade cracked slightly. His hands trembled as he lifted the first lid, revealing manila folders stuffed with papers that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. He began methodically sorting through police reports, witness statements, and photographs. The accident report was exactly as he remembered it. Emily's car found at the bottom of Miller's Ridge, the rainy conditions, the tragic conclusion. But as he dug deeper, something caught his eye. A missing person report filed 3 days before the accident. Harold's breath caught in his throat. He read the details again and again, his judicial mind struggling to process this information. Emily had been reported missing by a co-worker when she failed to show up for her shift at the women's shelter. Her car had been found in the shelter's parking lot, but there was no sign of her. 3 days later, she turned up dead in what appeared to be a tragic accident. How had he never questioned this? Harold ran his fingers through his gray hair, his other hand pressed flat against the yellowing paper. In the fog of grief following Emily's death, he'd accepted the official version of events without scrutiny. He'd been so focused on maintaining his composure, on being the stoic judge everyone expected, that he'd failed to ask the most basic questions about his own daughter's death. More details jumped out at him now. Emily's apartment had been searched during her disappearance, showing signs of hasty packing. Her bank account had shown no activity during those 3 days. And most disturbing of all, when her body was found, she had been wearing different clothes than those described in the missing person report. Harold spread the documents across the reading room table, trying to construct a timeline. The more he examined the evidence, the more questions arose. Where had Emily been for those 3 days? Why had no one investigated this gap more thoroughly? What had she been involved in at the women's shelter? The weight of these unanswered questions pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd prided himself on seeing through lies in his courtroom, on ferreting out the truth, yet he'd been blind to the mysteries surrounding his own daughter's death. Gathering the papers with trembling hands, Harold placed them back in their boxes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he made his way to the archive room door, his shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible burden. He barely nodded to Jonathan as he passed, his mind already racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. Harold pulled into the circular driveway of his Tudor-style home, the headlights sweeping across manicured shrubs and perfectly maintained flower beds. The house stood grand and imposing, just as it had for the past 30 years, but lately it felt more like a museum than a home, beautiful, pristine, and utterly lifeless. As he stepped through the heavy oak door, the silence enveloped him like a thick blanket. The foyer gleamed with polished hardwood floors and tasteful artwork, everything in its proper place. Margaret appeared in the hallway, her silver-streaked hair neatly styled, wearing one of her characteristic cream-colored sweater sets. "You're home early," she said, surprise coloring her voice. There was warmth in her tone, but it was cautious, measured, the kind of greeting you'd give to a respected acquaintance rather than a spouse of 40 years. "I had some things on my mind," Harold replied, hanging his coat in the closet with mechanical precision. The kitchen smelled of pot roast, Margaret's signature dish. Daniel sat at the dining room table, already seated, his laptop open beside his plate. At 32, he looked more like Harold every day, the same straight nose, the same serious set to his mouth, but his eyes were softer, more like Emily's had been. "Dad," Daniel nodded, closing his laptop. "Mom said you left work early. Everything okay?" Harold settled into his chair at the head of the table. "Fine, just a complicated case." Margaret served the food in careful portions, her movements precise and practiced. The only sound was the gentle clink of silverware against china. The tension stretched between them like a rubber band pulled too tight. "The Women's Shelter is holding their annual fundraiser next weekend," Margaret ventured, breaking the silence. "They're dedicating a new wing in Emily's name." The rubber band snapped. Harold's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "I thought we might all go," Margaret continued, her voice growing smaller. "As a family. It's been 15 years, Harold. Maybe it's time we—" "I have court dates to prepare for," Harold cut her off, his voice flat. Daniel set his fork down with more force than necessary. "Of course you do. Heaven forbid we actually acknowledge Emily's existence." "Daniel," Margaret warned, but he wasn't finished. "No, Mom. We tiptoe around her memory like she never existed. Dad buries himself in work, and we're supposed to pretend it's normal. She was my sister. Your daughter." Harold's knuckles whitened around his fork. "This isn't the time." "It's never the time," Margaret said quietly. "That's the problem, Harold. It's never the right time to talk about her, to remember her, to heal." After dinner, Margaret followed Harold into his study. Family photos lined the walls, carefully curated moments of happiness frozen in time. Emily's high school graduation, Daniel's Little League games, but the more recent frames showed only empty smiles and stiff poses. "Why can't you let yourself grieve?" Margaret asked, her voice cracking. "Why won't you let us help you?" Harold stood with his back to her, staring out the window into the darkness. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand. We lost her too, Harold, but we lost you as well, and you're still here." Unable to face her pain, Harold stepped out onto the back porch. The night air was cool against his face as he pulled out his wallet, finding the worn photograph he kept hidden behind his driver's license. Emily smiled up at him, forever 16, forever innocent. The image blurred as he stared at it, though he would never admit to the tears gathering in his eyes. The municipal records office was a stark contrast to Harold's usual domain. Instead of polished wood and leather-bound law books, metal filing cabinets lined institutional green walls under harsh fluorescent lighting. The air smelled of old paper and dust, a fitting atmosphere for digging into the past. Paula Jenkins, the records clerk, peered at him over wire-rimmed glasses. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her cardigan had seen better days. "Judge Calloway? This is unexpected. What can I help you with?" Harold cleared his throat. "I need to review some records from 15 to 20 years ago, specifically anything related to juvenile placements, foster care, and—" he hesitated. "Reports of teenage runaways in the East Side District." Paula's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "That's quite a broad search, Your Honor. Any particular names I should look for?" Jack Riker, Harold said quietly. And any incidents near Maple Street Park during that period? Paula nodded and disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets. Harold stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, fighting the urge to pace. After what seemed like an eternity, she returned with several boxes. "The reading room is through there," she said, gesturing to a small side room. "Let me know if you need anything else." Harold settled at the scratched wooden table, pulling files from the first box with trembling hands. Hours passed as he methodically worked through juvenile court records, foster care placements, and police reports. His reading glasses slid down his nose as he hunched over document after document. Then he saw it. His heart nearly stopped. Jack Riker, age 16, listed as residing at 1247 Cedar Avenue, just 2 blocks from where Emily had last been seen. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. Harold's judicial training kicked in as he began making notes, creating a timeline. Jack Riker's presence in that neighborhood, during that specific time period, couldn't be random. More details emerged. Multiple foster home placements, petty theft charges, a pattern of disappearances from various group homes. But it was the address that kept drawing Harold's attention. Cedar Avenue intersected with the park where Emily had spent her final days. The weight of these discoveries pressed down on Harold's chest. He gathered his notes with unsteady hands and thanked Paula on his way out, his mind already racing ahead to his next steps. Outside the records office, Harold noticed Russell Green, an elderly man who had lived in the East Side District for decades. Russell was walking his small dog, but stopped when he saw Harold. "Judge Calloway? Haven't seen you in this part of town for years." Harold nodded politely. "Mr. Green, I'm actually looking into some old cases. You've lived near Maple Street Park for quite a while, haven't you?" Russell's weathered face creased in thought. "Going on 40 years now. Seen a lot of changes, not all of them good. Used to be a lot of troubled kids hanging around there." "Do you remember?" Harold chose his words carefully. "A young man with tattoos? Would have been a teenager about 15 years ago?" "Come to think of it, yeah. Skinny kid, had some crude tattoos even then. Used to see him talking to this young woman who helped out at the soup kitchen." Russell shook his head. "She was one of the good ones, always trying to help those kids." Harold's throat tightened. He knew exactly who Russell was describing. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he wasn't sure he was ready to see. But he knew what he had to do next. He would have to face Jack Riker directly, no matter how much the prospect unsettled him. The holding facility's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Harold made his way down the stark corridor. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, matching the nervous rhythm of his heart. Bailiff Thompson walked beside him while Guard Kemp led the way, keys jangling at his belt. "He's been quiet since arrival, Your Honor," Kemp reported, his voice low. "Hasn't caused any trouble, but hasn't said much either." Harold nodded, straightening his tie as they approached the interrogation room. Through the small window in the metal door, he could see Jack Riker sitting at the table, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. The young man's posture was defensive, like a cornered animal ready to strike. Kemp unlocked the door and Harold stepped inside. The room was small and bare, with only a metal table and 2 chairs. The air felt thick with tension. Harold took his seat across from Jack, noting how the younger man's jaw clenched at his arrival. "Mr. Riker," Harold began, keeping his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "I'd like to ask you about that locket you're wearing." Jack's hand instinctively moved to his chest where the locket lay hidden beneath his prison jumpsuit. His eyes, hard and suspicious, met Harold's. "Nothing to tell," Jack muttered, his first words coming out rough and hostile. Harold leaned forward slightly. "That locket belonged to my daughter, Emily Calloway. I'd very much like to know how it came into your possession." Jack's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Emily's name. He shifted in his chair, his chains rattling slightly. "Never heard of her," Jack said flatly. "Found this in a pawn shop." Harold felt his patience wearing thin, but he maintained his composed exterior. "Mr. Riker, I know you lived near Maple Street Park 15 years ago, the same area where Emily was last seen before her death." "So what?" Jack's lip curled. "Lots of people lived there, doesn't mean anything." Please, Harold said, his voice softening slightly. If you know anything about what happened during those 3 days before her death. With all due respect, Your Honor, Jack interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Shouldn't you be staying neutral? Pretty sure judges aren't supposed to conduct their own investigations. The comment stung, but Harold pressed on. This isn't about being a judge. This is about being a father. Yeah? Well, maybe you should have thought about that before. Jack's words came out sharp and bitter. He leaned back in his chair, a cold smile playing at his lips. I got nothing to say to you. Harold's frustration mounted as he watched Jack retreat further into his defensive shell. Every question was met with either silence or deflection. The young man's hostility seemed to grow with each passing minute, his responses becoming increasingly aggressive. After several more failed attempts, Harold realized he was getting nowhere. He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Thank you for your time, Mr. Riker. Jack just stared at him, that same cold smile still in place. Outside the interrogation room, Bailiff Thompson fell into step beside Harold. Something's not right there, Your Honor. Most inmates try to curry favor with a judge, but Riker, he's different. Harold nodded slowly, his mind already working through alternative approaches. He's protecting something, Michael, or someone. He paused, looking back at the closed door. We need more information before we try again. The morning's failure weighed heavily on Harold's shoulders as he walked away, but his determination only grew stronger. There were other paths to the truth, and he would find them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Emily's bedroom window as Harold stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the familiar brass doorknob. The room remained exactly as it had been on that last morning. The pale blue walls, the white curtains gently stirring in the breeze, and the carefully made bed with its floral quilt. Even the faint scent of her lavender perfume seemed to linger, though Harold knew that was impossible after all these years. He stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Margaret had insisted on preserving the room, while Harold had avoided it, finding the memories too painful. Now he moved with purpose toward the wooden chest at the foot of Emily's bed. The brass clasps felt cool under his fingers as he carefully opened the lid. Inside, neatly organized, lay the artifacts of his daughter's life. Diaries bound in worn leather, photo albums with dog-eared corners, and various keepsakes that had meant something to Emily. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he lifted out the first diary. He had never read them before, respecting her privacy even in death. But now, searching for answers, he opened to a random page. The neat handwriting filled each line, and Harold began to read. Tonight was difficult. Nida needed medical attention, but we couldn't risk a hospital. Found a clinic that doesn't ask questions. JR helped get her there. He understands what it's like to need help, but fear asking for it. Harold's breath caught. JR. Could it be Jack Riker? He turned more pages, finding similar entries. 3 more runaways tonight. They're so young, so scared. We give them food, blankets, hope. Sometimes that's all we can offer, but it has to be enough for now. Someone needs to help those who have no voice. Another entry read, working at St. Mary's Shelter again, using the name Anne there. Safer that way. The staff thinks I'm just another volunteer, which is perfect. Easier to identify who needs the most help without drawing attention. Harold sat heavily on Emily's bed, the diary open in his lap. His daughter, his Emily, had led a secret life of compassion and courage right under his nose. While he had been presiding over cases in his courtroom, she had been out on the streets helping society's most vulnerable members. He returned to the chest, searching through more papers and notebooks. Each discovery revealed another layer of Emily's hidden world. Carefully documented accounts of people she'd helped, locations of safe houses, and coded messages he couldn't quite decipher. At the bottom of the chest, partially hidden beneath a folded sweater, Harold found a stack of photographs. He lifted them carefully, examining each one. Most showed abandoned buildings or street corners, seemingly meaningless until he realized they must be locations where Emily conducted her secret work. Then one photo made him pause. Emily stood smiling in front of a dilapidated brick building, her hair catching the sunlight. But it was the figure in the background that caught Harold's attention. Someone in a hooded jacket, half turned away from the camera. The image was grainy, but something about the stance seemed familiar. Harold slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket, his mind already working to identify the location. The brick pattern was distinctive, and there appeared to be a partially visible street sign in the corner. He stood slowly, taking one last look around the room. The afternoon light had dimmed, casting everything in a golden glow. The room felt different now, no longer just a shrine to loss, but a testament to Emily's strength and compassion. His daughter had been so much more than he had known, living a life of purpose and courage while he remained blind to it all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the worn linoleum tables of Pete's Corner Cafe, a modest establishment on the outskirts of town where time seemed to stand still. Harold sat in a corner booth, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. Across from him, Peter Armstrong, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, stirred sugar into his own cup. "It's been a while, Pete," Harold said, his voice low and measured. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice." Peter nodded, studying his old friend's face. When a judge calls asking for a favor, you show up, especially when that judge is Harold Calloway. Harold reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small notebook. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it to show Peter the entries he'd discovered in Emily's room. "My daughter. She was involved in something I never knew about." Peter leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he examined the pages. His expression grew serious as Harold explained about the locket around Jack Riker's neck and Emily's secret volunteer work. "That neighborhood," Peter said, sitting back with a heavy sigh. "The old Maxwell district. It was a different world back then, Harold. Still is, in many ways." Harold's coffee grew cold as Peter spoke, painting a picture of streets where desperate young people sought refuge in abandoned buildings. The retired detective's voice grew harder as he described the predators who saw those vulnerable souls as opportunities. "We knew there was a trafficking network operating in the area," Peter continued, his weathered face grim. "Small but organized. They'd target runaways, homeless kids, anyone who wouldn't be missed. We could never quite crack it open. Always seemed like someone was tipping them off whenever we got close." Harold's face drained of color. The thought of Emily being involved in something so dangerous made his stomach turn. "Why didn't I know about any of this? These cases should have crossed my bench." "Most never made it that far," Peter replied softly. "Victims were too scared to testify. Witnesses would disappear. Evidence would go missing. It was like trying to grab smoke." Harold stared into his coffee cup, seeing his reflection in the dark liquid. "And Jack Riker? What do you remember about him?" "Troubled kid. In and out of the system. But..." Peter paused, choosing his words carefully. "There was something different about him. Like he was trying to protect something or someone. Never could figure out what." The morning crowd began filtering into the cafe, their chatter a stark contrast to the heavy conversation in the corner booth. Peter reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn business card. "There's someone you should talk to," he said, sliding the card across the table. "Maria Hernandez. She ran a community center in the Maxwell district back then. Tried to help the kids, give them a safe place. If anyone knows what was really going on in those streets, it's her." Harold picked up the card, studying the faded text. "Is she still there?" "Last I heard. But Harold..." Peter leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Be careful. Some of those old wounds haven't healed, and some people prefer their secrets stayed buried." Harold tucked the card into his pocket, his jaw set with determination. As he stood to leave, Peter caught his arm. "One more thing. If Emily was helping people in that neighborhood, she might have stumbled onto something bigger than just helping runaways, something that got her noticed by the wrong people." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crumbling sidewalks of the Maxwell district as Harold's car crawled down streets he'd never visited before. Broken windows and graffiti-covered walls told stories of decades of neglect. The neighborhood felt frozen in time, preserved in its decay like a forgotten photograph. Harold parked his car near a small community center, its faded blue paint peeling in the summer heat. A weathered sign read, Maxwell Community Outreach, though several letters had fallen away. Outside, a woman in her 60s was tending to a small garden of resilient marigolds. "Maria Alvarez?" Harold called out, approaching carefully. "I'm Harold Calloway. Peter Armstrong suggested I speak with you." Maria straightened up, wiping soil from her hands onto well-worn jeans. Her eyes were kind but watchful, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen too much. "The judge? Yes, I remember hearing about you. About your daughter, too." Harold's throat tightened at the mention of Emily. "That's why I'm here. I need to understand what happened in this neighborhood 15 years ago." Maria gestured to a wooden bench nearby. As they sat, she spoke softly about the past. "A young woman used to come here at night. Never told us her real name, but she had a gentle way about her. Brought food, blankets, sometimes medicine for the sick ones." Harold pulled out an old photograph of Emily. Maria's eyes softened with recognition. "Yes, that's her. She was different from the other volunteers, wasn't afraid to go into the darker places where the most troubled kids stayed." She pointed across the street to a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. "That's where I last saw her. Right there, talking to some of the street kids." Harold walked to the spot, his footsteps echoing against brick walls. The alley was empty now, save for scattered debris and faded posters. His heart ached, imagining Emily standing in this very place, trying to help those in need. "There was a boy," Maria continued, joining him. "Always kept to himself. Lots of tattoos, even back then. Used to sleep behind the old Haven drop-in center." She gestured to a boarded-up building down the block. Harold's pulse quickened. "Jack Riker?" Maria shrugged. "Never knew his name. But he was always watching, always around when your daughter came by. Not threatening-like, more protective, maybe." Harold showed her the photograph from Emily's room, the one with the hooded figure in the background. Maria squinted at it, then nodded slowly. "That's the Haven Center, all right. It was a safe space for runaways before they shut it down." The whir of bicycle wheels interrupted them as a lanky teenager circled nearby, curious about the strangers in his neighborhood. "Hey, Ms. Maria," he called out. "Showing someone around?" "This is Terrence," Maria introduced him. "He knows every inch of these streets." Terrence hopped off his bike, pointing to a half-finished mural on a nearby wall. "You looking at the old artwork? That's been there forever." Harold stepped closer, studying the faded paint. Among the swirls of color and geometric patterns, a distinct symbol caught his eye, identical to one of the tattoos he'd noticed on Jack Riker's arm during the court hearing. The connection was undeniable now. Jack Riker hadn't just passed through this neighborhood. He'd been part of its fabric, present during Emily's final days. The locket, the location, the symbol, they weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle Harold was only beginning to understand, one that might finally reveal the truth about his daughter's fate. Back in his chambers the next morning, Harold stared at the neat stack of manila folders on his desk. The weight of yesterday's discoveries pressed heavily on his mind. He needed to see those tattoos again, really see them this time. "Michael," he called to his bailiff, "could you bring me Riker's intake photos? All of them." Minutes later, Harold spread the glossy photographs across his mahogany desk. Jack Riker's skin was a canvas of intricate artwork. Dragons writhing around his shoulders, barbed wire circling his forearms, faces both beautiful and grotesque peering out from his chest. But it was the smaller marks that caught Harold's attention, symbols scattered between the larger pieces, looking almost like ancient runes. With trembling fingers, he traced the patterns. Something about their placement seemed deliberate. He grabbed a legal pad and began sketching, trying to make sense of the geometric shapes. When he laid the photos side by side, certain marks aligned perfectly, forming larger symbols that matched the graffiti he'd seen in the old neighborhood. "These aren't random," he muttered to himself, drawing connecting lines between repeated elements. Some looked like initials, others like dates. One sequence appeared multiple times. JR, followed by what could be coordinates or street numbers. As the afternoon faded into evening, Harold remained hunched over his desk. Court clerk Serena Davis had long since said goodnight, leaving him alone with his investigation. The office grew quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the occasional rustle of papers. Near midnight, Harold's tired eyes caught something that made him sit up straight. There, on Jack Riker's left shoulder blade, was a small symbol, a triangle intersected by two curved lines. His hands shook as he pulled Emily's notebook from his briefcase. The same mark appeared in the margin of one of her final entries, next to a cryptic note about safe houses. Harold sank back in his chair, stunned by the implications. These weren't just decorative tattoos. They were a record, a testimony inked into flesh. Each symbol could represent a person, a place, or an event from Jack Riker's past. And somewhere in that maze of marks was Emily's story, waiting to be decoded. He gathered the photos into a neat pile, his mind racing. He would need to confront Jack Riker again, but this time he'd have leverage. The tattoos told a story Jack Riker couldn't deny, and Harold was beginning to understand their language. The next morning, Harold entered the holding facility with purposeful steps. His briefcase held the photographs and evidence he'd gathered, pieces of a puzzle he was finally ready to solve. Guard Isaac Kemp led him to the familiar interrogation room where Jack Riker waited, still maintaining his tough exterior. Harold took his seat across the metal table and methodically laid out the photographs of Jack's tattoos. He watched Jack's expression carefully, noting how the younger man's jaw tightened at the sight. "I visited your old neighborhood," Harold said quietly. "The Haven Drop-In Center. That symbol there," he pointed to a specific tattoo on Jack's forearm, "matches the one on their wall." Jack's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. "I know you were there 15 years ago," Harold continued, "the same time my daughter was helping runaways." Jack's fingers twitched slightly, brushing against the locket that still hung around his neck. "That shelter saved lives," Harold pressed, "and Emily was there, wasn't she?" Something in Jack's expression cracked. He looked down at the photographs, then back at Harold. "She gave me soup," he said finally, his voice rough. "It was winter. I hadn't eaten in 2 days." Harold's heart clenched as Jack continued. "She noticed I didn't have anything. No photos, no memories, nothing to hold on to, so she gave me this." He touched the locket. "Said everyone should have something precious." "Did you?" Harold's voice caught. "Were you there when she—" "No," Jack said firmly. "I'd never hurt her. She was the only one who—" He swallowed hard. "She warned me about this guy. Real bad news. He'd been targeting kids like me, offering them jobs that weren't jobs. Emily figured out what he was doing. She told me to get out while I could." Harold sat very still, absorbing this revelation. His daughter, his Emily, had been more than just a volunteer. She'd been trying to save these young people from something sinister. "I left town after that," Jack admitted. "Things were getting dangerous, but I kept this—" He touched the locket again. "To remember there are good people in the world. People like her." Harold stared at the young man before him, seeing him truly for the first time. Not a criminal, but a scared kid his daughter had tried to protect. His throat felt tight with grief and pride and regret. Pride in Emily's courage, regret for how little he'd known of her life. Rising slowly, Harold gathered the photographs. He needed time to process this new truth about his daughter, about the dangers she'd faced alone while trying to help others. The next morning, Harold pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Haven Drop-In Center. The building's faded blue paint and weathered sign spoke of years of service to the community's most vulnerable. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the front doors where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted him. "I'm Bridget Hall, the shelter manager," she said, extending her hand. "How can I help you?" Harold introduced himself, explaining his search for information about a volunteer from years ago. Bridget nodded thoughtfully and led him to a small office cluttered with filing cabinets. "We keep all our old records," she said, pulling out a worn logbook. "What year did you say?" As Bridget flipped through the yellowed pages, Harold removed a sample of Emily's handwriting from his briefcase. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the familiar loops and curves of his daughter's penmanship. "Here," Bridget said suddenly, pointing to an entry. Anna Fields. She volunteered late nights, mostly with the teenage residents. Harold leaned forward, his heart pounding. The handwriting in the logbook matched Emily's perfectly, the distinctive way she crossed her T's, the slight slant to her letters. He touched the page gently, imagining her writing it. "Let me get Elijah for you," Bridget offered. "He worked nights back then." Minutes later, a tall man with graying hair entered the office. Elijah Brooks had deep laugh lines around his eyes, though his expression turned serious as Harold explained his quest. "Anna Fields?" Elijah's face lit with recognition. "Of course I remember her. Such a compassionate young woman. She'd bring supplies, blankets, food, warm clothes. The kids trusted her." "Did you ever see her with a young man?" Harold asked carefully. "Someone with tattoos?" Elijah nodded slowly. "Yes, a troubled kid. She brought him in a couple times, tried to convince him to stay. I remember her being really worried about him, telling him to be careful, to stay away from someone dangerous in the neighborhood." He paused. "I never knew who she was warning him about, but she seemed frightened for him." Harold sat back, overwhelmed by these confirmations of Jack's story. His daughter had lived this secret life, working to protect vulnerable youth, while he remained oblivious in his world of law and order. The truth of her courage and compassion filled him with both pride and deep sadness. Harold made his way through the old neighborhood, his polished shoes out of place on the cracked sidewalks. He approached various people, carefully asking if they remembered a volunteer named Anna Fields. Most shook their heads or hurried away until he spotted a young woman leaving a corner store in a retail uniform. "Excuse me," he called out softly. "I'm looking for information about someone who helped people here years ago. Her name was Anna Fields." The woman froze, then turned slowly. "Anna Fields?" Her voice trembled slightly. "She saved my life." "I'm Harold Calloway," he said. "Would you mind telling me about her?" Lillian Moore nodded, leading him to a nearby bench. "I was 16, living on the streets. This pimp was pressuring me, threatening me. Anna, she stepped in, stood up to him, helped me get away, found me a safe place to stay." Lillian's eyes grew distant. After she confronted him a few times, he disappeared. Just vanished. Harold's hands clenched. "Do you know anyone else who might remember those days?" "Carlos Ramirez," Lillian said. "He knows everything that happened on these streets. You'll find him in Jefferson Park around sunset." As dusk settled, Harold found Carlos sitting on a weathered park bench. The street informant's weathered face creased with concern as Harold mentioned Anna Fields. "Yeah, I remember her," Carlos said, glancing around nervously. "She caused trouble for some dangerous people. There was this trafficking ring, small but connected. Real nasty business." "What kind of trouble?" Harold pressed. Carlos lowered his voice. "She confronted one of their recruiters, Victor Santos. Mean piece of work. Nobody stood up to him. But she did." He shuddered. "Santos disappeared right after she died. Always wondered if there was a connection." Harold felt his blood run cold. "Victor Santos," he repeated, writing the name down with shaking hands. "Be careful with that name," Carlos warned. "Even now, people around here don't like to talk about him. If your Anna got his attention." He left the sentence unfinished. Harold stood, tucking the paper into his pocket. The weight of this new information pressed down on him like a physical burden. Emily had faced this darkness alone, trying to protect others, while he had remained blind in his courtroom tower of justice. Harold walked into the holding facility the next morning, his briefcase heavy with evidence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he entered the small interrogation room where Jack sat, arms crossed defensively. Bailiff Thompson positioned himself quietly by the door. "I know about Victor Santos," Harold said quietly, spreading out the shelter logs on the metal table. "And I know my daughter tried to protect you from him." Jack's eyes flickered at the name, though he tried to hide his reaction. His jaw tightened as he stared at the papers. "These are volunteer logs," Harold continued, his voice gentle but firm. "She went by Anna Fields, helped runaways, gave out food and blankets." He paused, watching Jack's face. warned them about Santos. "You don't know what you're talking about," Jack scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. Harold pulled out more papers, witness statements, old photographs, shelter records. "She was there for you, wasn't she? When Santos was recruiting?" Jack's shoulders tensed. He glanced at the guard, then back at Harold. The tough exterior began to crack. Jack swallowed hard. "She told me to stay away from his people. Said they'd promise you everything but take your soul." His voice grew quiet. "I was just some street kid. She didn't have to care." "But she did care," Harold said softly. "That's who she was." Jack uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "I knew something was wrong. Those last few days she seemed scared. But I was just a stupid kid." His voice cracked. "What could I do? Santos had people everywhere." Harold watched pain and regret wash across Jack's face. "You were young and powerless then," he acknowledged, "but you're not anymore." Jack met Harold's gaze, really looking at him for the first time. "You want my help finding the ones who hurt her?" "Yes," Harold said simply. "Will you?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, fingering the locket around his neck. Finally, he nodded grimly. "Yeah, for her, I will." The tension in the room shifted as an unspoken agreement formed between them. Two unlikely allies united by their connection to Emily and their shared desire for justice. Harold sat alone in his study that evening, the remnants of another tense family dinner weighing on him. Margaret and Daniel had exchanged worried glances throughout the meal, noticing his distraction, but he couldn't bring himself to share what he'd discovered. Not yet. With trembling hands, he spread Emily's belongings across his mahogany desk. The leather-bound diaries, once symbols of his grief, now held potential answers. He opened them carefully, reading each entry with new understanding. One particular passage made him pause. "Late nights at the old Riverside factory, strange cars coming and going. VS thinks no one notices, but I'm watching. Need more proof before going to authorities. These girls deserve justice." Harold's breath caught. Emily hadn't just been helping runaways. She'd been gathering evidence against Victor Santos. Another entry mentioned documentation hidden where they won't look. His daughter, barely out of college, had been building a case against dangerous criminals. He flipped through more pages, finding scattered references that now made chilling sense. Emily had noted license plate numbers, times, locations. She'd been methodical, careful, determined to expose the trafficking ring's leadership. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. Harold quickly closed the diary, but not before she noticed the tear rolling down his cheek. "Harold?" she said softly, stepping into the room. He couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the weight of Emily's secret courage. Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away from the comfort she offered. Though the words wouldn't come to explain what he'd found, something shifted between them in that moment. Harold made a silent vow to honor his daughter's bravery by finishing what she'd started. The next morning, Harold entered the holding facility's interrogation room with a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. Guard Isaac Kemp took his usual position by the door as Jack was brought in, his chains clinking against the metal table. Harold spread out the photocopied images of Jack's tattoos, arranging them carefully. For the first time since their encounters began, Jack pulled his chair closer, leaning in with genuine interest. "These markings," Harold said quietly, "I believe they tell a story." Jack nodded slowly, his finger moving to a particular design on his forearm. "Each one means something, or someone." His voice was rough but steady. "This spiral here? That's for Maria. She disappeared one night after talking to the wrong people." Harold watched intently as Jack pointed to other symbols, a broken crown, a twisted rope, a series of interconnected triangles. Each represented someone who had crossed paths with Victor Santos's operation. Some had vanished, Others had been found in ways that still haunted Jack's dreams. This one, Jack said, tapping a complex pattern of linked initials, stands for Tommy Reeves. He was a recruiter for Santos, used to hang around bus stations looking for runaways. Jack's jaw tightened. He's still out there, probably still working for them. Harold leaned forward, pen poised over his legal pad. Tommy Reeves could connect Santos to what happened back then? Yeah, he knows everything. Every girl that went missing, every kid that got caught up in their web. Jack's fingers unconsciously moved to Emily's locket. He was there when your daughter started asking questions. Harold's pen paused mid-stroke. Emily was gathering evidence against them. She was braver than any of us, Jack admitted, his tough exterior cracking slightly. She kept detailed records, took photos, said she was going to expose everything. The weight of this revelation settled over both men. Harold thought of Emily's diary entries, her careful documentation, her determination to help those who couldn't help themselves. Jack stared at the tattoos that marked his skin like a map of lost souls. "We need to find Reeves," Harold said firmly. "He's our link to Santos." Jack nodded grimly. "But we've got to be careful. These people, they have eyes everywhere. One wrong move and—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Harold understood. As Harold gathered his materials to leave, he noticed Jack clutching the locket, the small piece of Emily he'd allowed Jack to keep. In that moment, their shared purpose crystallized, to finish what Emily had started, to bring justice to those who had silenced her voice. Later that afternoon, Harold made his way to Riverside Park, where Peter Armstrong waited on a weathered bench beneath an old oak tree. The retired detective's weathered face creased with concern as Harold approached, manila folder in hand. "I've got something, Peter," Harold said, settling onto the bench. He spread out the sketches of Jack's tattoos and explained their significance. "And there's more. A name keeps coming up. Victor Santos." Peter's expression darkened. "Santos," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "That name crossed my desk a few times back in the day. Slippery character. Never could pin anything on him." Harold watched a pair of joggers pass before continuing in a low voice. "Jack Riker says Santos was running a trafficking operation, the same one Emily was trying to expose." Peter leaned back, his eyes distant as he searched old memories. After a long moment, he straightened. "Wait a minute. There was this guy, Martin Delgado, used to do odd jobs for Santos. Nothing major, mostly running messages, keeping lookout." "What happened to him?" Harold asked, pen hovering over his notepad. "Word is he got spooked and left town maybe 5-6 years ago." Peter's voice dropped lower. "Last I heard, he was somewhere up north. Changed his name, tried to start fresh." Harold's pulse quickened. "If we could find him?" "He might talk," Peter finished. "He wasn't high up enough to know everything, but he'd have seen things. Maybe enough to connect Santos to what happened to Emily." They sat in silence for a moment, watching leaves scatter across the path. Harold knew he'd have to move carefully. As a judge, he couldn't officially investigate. Any wrong step could alert Santos or compromise potential evidence. "I'll ask around," Peter offered. "Still have some contacts who remember those days. Might be able to track down where Delgado landed." Harold nodded, gathering the papers back into his folder. The autumn sun was setting earlier now, casting long shadows across the park. He pulled out the old photograph of Emily at the shelter, studying her determined smile. "Just be careful," Peter warned. "Santos has managed to stay untouchable all these years for a reason." The next morning, Harold stepped into the familiar interrogation room where Jack waited, his tattooed arms resting on the metal table. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across both their faces. "I've got a name," Harold said, keeping his voice low. "Martin Delgado. He used to work for Santos, running errands, keeping watch." Jack's eyes widened with recognition. "Delgado? Yeah, I remember hearing about him. Skinny guy, always nervous. He disappeared maybe 5-6 years back." Harold spread a map across the table. "Any idea where he might have gone?" Jack leaned forward, studying the worn paper. His finger traced several routes leading north. "There was talk. People said he headed up this way, mentioned something about cheap motels, places where nobody asks questions. Later that afternoon, Harold met Peter at the public library. The old building smelled of dust and aged paper. Marlene Carter, the librarian who'd known Harold for decades, led them to a secluded corner table behind the reference section. "I've been making calls," Peter whispered, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "Last known address was the Pine Grove Motel, 2 counties north. It's not much, but it's something." Harold studied the address, committing it to memory. "I'll need to take some time off from the courthouse." "Be careful," Peter warned. "This kind of digging, and it could stir up trouble." That evening, Harold sat at his desk at home, surrounded by notes and maps. The lamp cast a warm glow over Emily's photograph, propped against a stack of files. He heard Margaret's soft footsteps before she appeared in the doorway. "Harold?" Her voice was gentle but worried. "You've barely eaten all day." He looked up, seeing the concern etched on her face. "I know I've been distant," he said, "but I'm making progress. Real progress this time." Margaret stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're different lately. More present, somehow. Even when you're caught up in all this." "I need to see this through," Harold said quietly. "For Emily. For all of us." Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently. "Just don't lose yourself in it completely." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked parking lot as Harold pulled into the Riverbend Motel. The neon sign buzzed and flickered weakly against the darkening sky, its red letters spelling out VAC NCY with the A permanently dark. The 2-story building had seen better days. Paint peeled from the wooden railings, and several windows were covered with faded newspapers. Harold sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The drive had given him time to rehearse his approach, but now that he was here, anxiety crept into his chest. He stepped out, straightened his tie, a habit from decades on the bench, and walked toward the office. A bell jingled as he pushed open the glass door. Behind a scratched Formica counter, an elderly woman looked up from her crossword puzzle. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck. "Need a room?" Viola Grant asked, her voice rough from years of cigarettes. "Actually," Harold began, choosing his words carefully, "I'm hoping you might help me with something else." He noticed how her eyes narrowed slightly, protective of her guest's privacy. "I'm trying to piece together some family history," he added softly. Viola straightened in her chair. "We don't give out information about our guests." "I understand completely," Harold said, his tone gentle, "but this involves my daughter. She passed away several years ago, and I'm trying to understand the work she was doing with troubled youth." He pulled out Emily's photograph, showing it to Viola. She tried to help people who had nowhere else to go. Something in Viola's expression shifted. She studied the photograph, then Harold's face, seeing the grief that still lingered there. "Your daughter sounds like a special person," she said quietly. "She was," Harold replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm looking for someone who might have known her. A man named Martin Delgado." Viola hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a thick ledger. "Give me a minute," she said, flipping through yellowed pages. Her finger traced down columns of names and dates. "We had someone staying here a few months back. Used the name Miguel Diaz, but the handwriting..." She looked up at Harold. Something about him seemed scared, like he was running from something. Harold's heart quickened. Did he leave anything behind? Viola disappeared into a back room. Harold heard boxes being moved, drawers opening and closing. When she returned, she held a manila envelope, its edges worn and soft. "Found this when we cleaned the room," she said. "Never felt right to throw it away, but never knew what to do with it either." She extended the envelope toward Harold. "Maybe it'll help you find what you're looking for." Back in his car, Harold carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were printouts of old newspaper articles, their edges yellow and crisp. Each one detailed missing teenagers, faces Harold recognized from Emily's era. from the streets she'd tried to protect. In the margins, written in hurried handwriting, were notes that echoed the cryptic entries from Emily's diary. One note particularly caught his eye. Factory on River Street, VS Operations Center. EC was right. Next to it was a crude map, showing loading docks and side entrances. Harold's throat tightened as he realized Emily had been methodically gathering evidence, leaving breadcrumbs for anyone brave enough to follow. Harold strode through the holding facility's corridors early the next morning, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floors. The manila envelope felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the responsibility of what its contents might reveal. When he entered the interrogation room, Jack Riker was already seated, his expression guarded but expectant. "I found something," Harold said, carefully laying out the newspaper clippings on the metal table between them. These were left behind by Martin Delgado. Jack leaned forward, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages. His fingers, covered in intricate tattoos, traced the edges of the articles. Suddenly, he stopped, pointing to a small symbol scratched in the corner of one page, a crude drawing of what looked like an interconnected triangle and circle. "This," Jack said, his voice low and serious. "I've got this same mark." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing an identical symbol inked into his skin. It was how we marked safe spots, places where kids could hide when things got bad. The factory was one of them, at least until Santos's crew started using it. Harold watched Jack's face carefully. "What kind of business did Santos conduct there?" Jack's jaw tightened. "The worst kind. We'd see fancy cars pull up late at night. Sometimes you'd hear screams." He paused, swallowing hard. "That's probably what your daughter stumbled onto." Harold took a deep breath, steadying himself. He'd spent the night making calls, pulling strings he'd never thought he'd use. "I've arranged for a supervised release," he said. "Prison Liaison Officer Hawkins has approved it. We're going to that factory." Jack's eyes widened. "You're risking a lot, Your Honor, if anyone finds out—" "Some things matter more than rules," Harold interrupted, thinking of Emily's diary entries, her secret crusade for justice. "Bailiff Thompson will help coordinate. We leave this afternoon." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and paperwork. Harold met briefly with Bailiff Thompson, who helped arrange the logistics while maintaining discretion. The bailiff understood the gravity of the situation, having witnessed Harold's transformation over the past few days. As late afternoon approached, Harold waited in the holding facility's processing area. Jack emerged, now wearing plain clothes instead of his prison uniform. The locket still hung around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. Though no longer in shackles, he moved carefully, aware of the trust being placed in him. "I never thought I'd be doing this," Jack said quietly as they walked toward Harold's car. "But your daughter, she tried to help me when nobody else would. I owe her this." Harold nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on him. His judicial career, his reputation, everything he'd built over decades. All of it could crumble if this went wrong. But the image of Emily's handwriting in those diaries, her determination to expose the truth despite the danger, strengthened his resolve. They climbed into Harold's sedan, the leather seats creaking softly. The abandoned factory district waited on the other side of town, its empty buildings holding secrets that had festered for far too long. Harold started the engine, glancing at Jack in the passenger seat. Both men understood that there would be no turning back after this. The evening sun cast long shadows across the abandoned industrial complex as Harold and Jack made their way carefully between the derelict buildings. Their footsteps crunched on broken glass and gravel, echoing in the eerie stillness. The factory loomed ahead, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at them, but they turned their attention to the adjacent warehouse first. Jack moved with the practiced stealth of someone who'd spent years navigating dangerous spaces. Harold followed close behind, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place among the urban decay. The warehouse's metal door groaned softly as they eased it open, the sound making both men wince. Inside, the air hung heavy with the musty smell of abandonment. Weak light filtered through broken windows, illuminating scattered crates and debris. Harold's eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, taking in the graffiti-covered walls and piles of discarded clothing that spoke of squatters and desperate souls seeking shelter. "Look," Jack whispered, pointing to fresh cigarette butts near a stack of wooden pallets. "Someone's been here recently." A sudden scraping sound from the shadows made them freeze. Harold's heart hammered in his chest as footsteps approached from behind a wall of stacked crates. A thin man with darting eyes emerged, his worn jacket hanging loose on his frame. Ramon Diaz sized them up quickly, recognition flickering across his face as he spotted Jack. "Riker?" Ramon's voice was rough. His gaze shifted nervously to Harold, taking in the expensive suit and commanding presence. "You shouldn't be here, either of you." Harold stepped forward, keeping his voice steady and calm. "We're looking for information, nothing more." "Information gets people killed," Ramon spat, edging toward the door. Jack moved slightly, blocking Ramon's path. "Victor Santos," he said quietly. "That name still mean anything around here?" Ramon's reaction was instant. His shoulders tensed and color drained from his face. "Don't," he hissed. "Some things better stay buried. Some stories ain't worth dying over." "A young woman died here years ago," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was trying to help people, to stop what was happening." "The judge's daughter," Ramon muttered, realization dawning in his eyes as he looked more closely at Harold. "Listen, whatever you think you're gonna find—" "Martin Delgado," Jack interrupted. "We know he's around here somewhere." Ramon backed up against the pallets, trapped between them and his conscience. Harold could see the internal struggle playing across his features. "Please," Harold said softly. "She was my daughter." Ramon ran a trembling hand through his hair, glancing nervously at the shadows. "You got no idea what you're stepping into," he warned. Then, after a long moment, "Delgado's holed up in the old garage, block east of here. Place with the caved-in roof." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Santos never left the shadows," Ramon added, his voice barely above a whisper. "He just waits, like a spider in his web." Harold and Jack watched Ramon disappear into the gathering darkness. The encounter left them both shaken, but more determined than ever. They had confirmation now. Not only was Martin Delgado within reach, but Victor Santos still pulled strings from the shadows. They exchanged a meaningful look, both understanding that they'd crossed a threshold. The truth they sought was close, but so was the danger that had claimed Emily's life all those years ago. The abandoned garage loomed before them, its partially collapsed roof creating jagged shadows in the dim streetlight. Harold and Jack approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty lot. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. A figure huddled in the darkest corner, clutching what appeared to be a rusty pipe. "Martin Delgado," Jack called out softly, causing the man to jerk upright. "Stay back!" Martin's voice cracked with fear. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his eyes darted wildly between them and the exit. "I'll run. I swear I will." Harold reached slowly into his jacket, pulling out the photograph of Emily. "We know about Santos," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We know about the trafficking ring. My daughter tried to stop it." Martin's hands trembled on the pipe. "Your daughter?" His eyes fixed on the photograph, recognition dawning on his weathered face. "I remember her," he whispered, lowering the makeshift weapon. "She wasn't afraid of anyone. Came right up to me one day, said she knew what Santos was doing to those kids." Tears welled in his eyes. "She begged me to help her expose everything, but I was too scared." Harold's throat tightened. "What happened?" "Santos found out she was gathering evidence, talking to people." Martin slid down the wall, shoulders shaking. "She wasn't just helping runaways anymore, she was building a case. Then that accident happened." He spat the word with bitter emphasis. Jack stepped closer. "Santos arranged it?" Martin nodded, unable to meet their eyes. He had to silence her. She knew too much, was getting too close to the truth. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I should have helped her. Maybe she'd still be alive if I had." Harold fought to maintain his composure as the truth of his daughter's death finally emerged. Martin suddenly straightened, as if remembering something important. "There's a ledger," he said urgently. "Hidden in the factory's sub-basement, behind a loose brick in the north wall. Names, dates, payoffs, everything. Santos's network is still active." His eyes darted nervously to the shadows. "Please, I've told you what I know. Don't let them find out I talked." Harold nodded solemnly. "Thank you for telling us the truth." As they turned to leave, Jack's jaw clenched tight with anger. Emily had been so close to exposing everything, to saving countless lives. If only someone had been brave enough to stand with her when it mattered most. The midnight air hung heavy as Harold and Jack stood at the perimeter of the abandoned factory. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting strange shadows across the weed-choked grounds. The building's skeletal frame stretched toward the sky, its rusted beams groaning in the wind. Faded company logos, barely visible on the crumbling walls, seemed to watch their approach like ghostly eyes. "Ready?" Harold whispered, gripping his flashlight tightly. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Their footsteps echoed through empty corridors as they entered, each sound amplified in the hollow space. Harold's flashlight beam cut through layers of dust, revealing scattered debris and fallen ceiling tiles. Jack moved with practiced stealth, pausing occasionally to listen for any unusual sounds. Deep within the factory's maze-like interior, they discovered a heavy metal door set into the floor. The lock, though sturdy once, had succumbed to years of rust and neglect. Jack retrieved a metal rod from nearby debris and worked at the mechanism, his movements careful and precise. With a grinding screech, the lock finally gave way. The sub-basement stretched before them, a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow Harold's flashlight beam. The air was thick with decay and abandonment. Dusty crates lined the walls, their contents long forgotten. Scattered folders and papers littered the floor, and ancient machinery cast twisted shadows in the dim light. Following Martin's directions, they methodically searched the space. In a corner, Harold's light fell upon a storage locker, its door hanging crookedly on broken hinges. Inside, partially hidden behind fallen debris, sat a metal box. Harold's hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside lay the ledger, its pages yellowed but intact. As they carefully turned the pages, names and numbers emerged. A detailed record of Santos's operation. In the margins, they found what they were looking for. Emily's name marked as a problem to be dealt with. Harold's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the evidence his daughter had died trying to collect. Jack placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his expression hardening with determination. They had what they needed: proof of Santos's crimes and the conspiracy that had claimed Emily's life. Harold and Jack huddled in a small, dusty office within the abandoned factory, their faces illuminated by the weak glow of a battery-powered lantern. The leather-bound ledger lay open between them on a rusted metal desk, its pages revealing the dark secrets they had sought for so long. "Look at this," Harold said, his finger tracing along a column of numbers. "These must be payment records." His voice trembled slightly as he read entry after entry, each one representing another victim of Santos's operation. Jack leaned closer, his expression grim. "The dates match up with when I was on the streets. He was running everything, controlling everyone." He pointed to a series of initials in the margins. "These were kids I knew, some of them just disappeared." Harold turned another page and his breath caught. There, in familiar handwriting, were Emily's notes. Careful observations, dates, and locations, all methodically documented. She had been building a case piece by piece, gathering evidence that could have brought down Santos's entire network. "She was so thorough," Harold whispered, pride mixing with grief in his voice. She knew exactly what she was doing. Needing a moment to collect himself, Harold stepped outside the factory. The cool night air filled his lungs as he pulled out his phone and dialed Peter Armstrong's number. The retired detective answered on the second ring. "Peter, we found it," Harold said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "The ledger. It's everything Emily discovered and more. Names, dates, locations. It's all here." Harold, listen to me carefully. Peter's voice crackled through the speaker. Santos has eyes everywhere. If you've got solid evidence, he'll know soon enough. His people never really left. They just went deeper underground. We can't let this slip away again, Harold insisted. Not after what he did to Emily? Just be careful, Peter warned. Santos didn't survive this long by being careless. Harold returned to the office where Jack waited, the ledger now safely tucked inside his jacket. The younger man's face was etched with determination and fear. We need to draw him out, Jack said as Harold settled back into the cramped space. Make him show himself. They pored over the ledger's entries, studying locations and patterns. A nearby foundry appeared repeatedly in the records, a gathering place for Santos's inner circle. Here, Jack pointed to an address. This was where they'd meet when things got serious. The old Crown Foundry. As the first hints of dawn crept through the broken windows, their plan took shape. They would make themselves visible, present an obvious target. Santos wouldn't be able to resist eliminating two threats at once. The judge who could expose him and the street kid who knew too much. Jack's hand moved to the locket hanging around his neck, his fingers wrapping around it like a talisman. Emily tried to save me once, he said softly. Maybe now I can help finish what she started. Harold watched the young man, seeing not the hardened criminal who had stood in his courtroom, but someone his daughter had deemed worthy of saving. We'll need to be careful, he said. Santos won't come alone. I know these streets, Jack replied. I know how they think, how they move. It's time someone stood up to them. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as the two men studied the foundry's layout one final time. The weight of what they were about to attempt settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were about to challenge a man who had orchestrated countless crimes, including Emily's death, and had never faced justice. The morning sun filtered through the foundry's broken windows, casting long shadows across rusted machinery and debris. Harold and Jack moved cautiously through the cavernous space, their footsteps echoing off metal walls. The ledger felt heavy in Harold's jacket pocket, a weight that carried all their hopes for justice. A figure emerged from behind a massive support beam, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial decay. Victor Santos stood there, his silver hair neatly combed, his face lined but still carrying the same cruel confidence that had terrorized these streets for decades. Behind him, Damian Wells gripped a pistol, his eyes cold and watchful. Santos's lips curved into a mocking smile. Judge Calloway, I wondered if you'd ever figure it out. His gaze shifted to Jack. And the street rat returns. How disappointing. Harold pulled out the ledger, holding it high. It's finished, Santos. Everything's documented here, the trafficking, the murders, Emily's death. His voice carried across the empty space, steady and determined. You can't hide anymore. A harsh laugh escaped Santos's throat. Hide? You simple fool. He took a step forward, gesturing casually. You think having that book makes you powerful? Makes you safe? He nodded to Wells. Take them. The armed man moved forward, but Jack was faster. In one fluid motion, he grabbed a length of pipe from a pile of debris and swung it hard, catching Wells's arm. The gun clattered across the concrete floor. The foundry erupted into chaos as bodies collided and shouts echoed off the walls. In the confusion, Santos's hand flashed with metallic gleam, a concealed blade catching the morning light. He lunged toward Harold with deadly precision, the knife aimed at the judge's heart. But Jack saw it coming. Without hesitation, Jack threw himself between them. The blade sank deep into his chest instead of Harold's. Jack's gasp of pain filled the sudden silence. Distant sirens began to wail, growing closer. Santos's face contorted with rage and fear. He yanked the blade free and fled toward a back exit, disappearing into the shadows. Harold caught Jack as he collapsed, lowering him gently to the floor. Blood spread across Jack's shirt, dark and relentless. His breathing came in ragged gasps. Stay with me, son, Harold pleaded, pressing his hands against the wound. Help is coming. Jack's fingers clutched weakly at Emily's locket, his eyes fixed on Harold's face as the sirens grew louder. Blood pooled beneath Jack's body as Harold knelt beside him on the cold concrete floor. The morning light streamed through the foundry's broken windows, casting long shadows across Jack's pale face. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one more labored than the last. "Hold on, son," Harold urged, pressing his hands against the wound. "Help is coming." Jack coughed, crimson staining his lips. Despite the pain etched across his features, a strange peace seemed to settle over him. With trembling fingers, he reached for the locket around his neck, the same one that had started this whole journey. The chain caught slightly as he pulled it free. "Open it," Jack whispered, pressing the small metal heart into Harold's palm. His hand was slick with blood, but surprisingly steady. A faint smile touched his lips. Not the defensive smirk Harold had grown used to, but something genuine and tender. In that moment, Harold saw what Emily must have seen years ago. Not a troubled delinquent, but a wounded soul worthy of saving. Jack's eyes, once sharp with street-learned wariness, grew distant. His chest rose one final time, then stilled. Harold bowed his head, overwhelmed by the sacrifice of this young man who had given his life to protect Emily's father. With hands that shook slightly, Harold examined the locket more closely. His fingers found a tiny catch he'd never noticed before, revealing a hidden compartment within. Inside, folded with careful precision, was a small piece of paper. Harold gently extracted it as the sound of running footsteps echoed in the distance. The paper was worn soft at the creases, but Emily's handwriting remained clear and steady across the page. Harold's vision blurred as he began to read. "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I know you never understood why I spent so many nights away from home, why I couldn't just focus on my studies and follow the path you laid out. But I saw people suffering, kids like Jack with nowhere to go, no one to protect them. I couldn't turn away. You threw yourself into your work, into upholding justice from behind the bench. But justice isn't just about laws and procedures. Sometimes it's about reaching out when everyone else turns away. That's what I learned on these streets. I forgive you, Dad. I forgive the silence at dinner, the disappointed looks, the emotional distance. I understand now that you were protecting yourself from more loss, but you can't live that way forever. There's so much good you could do if you opened your heart again. These kids need someone with your strength, your principles, your position of authority. They need someone who will fight for them within the system. Please don't let my death make you retreat further. Let it open your eyes to the work that still needs to be done. Let it soften your heart to those who seem beyond redemption. I love you, Dad. I always have. Emily." Heavy footsteps approached as Peter Armstrong arrived with emergency personnel in tow. Harold clutched the letter in one hand and the damning ledger in the other, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. His daughter's words wrapped around his heart, offering both absolution and purpose. He looked up at the sunlight streaming through the foundry's broken windows, understanding at last the full measure of Emily's compassion and Jack's redemption. They had both seen something worth saving in each other, and ultimately in him as well. The morning sun filtered through the living room windows as Harold sat in his favorite armchair, a white bandage visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. Margaret and Daniel gathered close, their faces etched with concern and newfound understanding. The room felt different now, warmer, more open, as if Emily's presence had somehow returned to fill the spaces between them. "She was trying to save them," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "All those nights we thought she was being rebellious. She was out there helping kids like Jack, giving them hope when no one else would." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as Harold described Jack's final moments of bravery. "He could have run," Harold continued. "Instead, he put himself between Santos and me, the same way Emily put herself between those kids in danger." Daniel squeezed his father's shoulder, no longer the distant gesture of obligation it might have been days ago. "She would be proud, Dad, of you and Jack both." The phone rang, breaking the intimate moment. It was Peter Armstrong, his voice animated with progress. "Elena Park's team is moving fast," he reported. 3 arrests already this morning. The ledger is everything we needed. Dates, locations, payment records. Santos's whole operation is coming apart. "Make sure they know about Jack," Harold insisted firmly. "I want his sacrifice on record. He wasn't just another criminal. He died protecting a judge, trying to finish what Emily started." "Already done," Peter assured him. His story will be told right. After hanging up, Harold carefully unfolded Emily's letter again. The words felt different now, less like an accusation and more like a guide forward. He looked up at Margaret and Daniel, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time in years. "I've been hiding behind my robes," he admitted softly, "using the law as a shield against feeling too much. But Emily was right. Justice needs heart. And you both deserve better than what I've given." Margaret moved closer, taking his hand. Daniel remained steady at his shoulder. Together they sat in the morning light, a family slowly healing, while somewhere in the city, Emily's work continued through the ripples of truth and compassion she'd set in motion. The small park was quiet that afternoon, as Harold stood before a modest gathering. A gentle breeze rustled the wildflowers placed beside Jack Riker's photograph, a stern booking photo that somehow captured both his tough exterior and hidden dignity. Jack Riker wasn't just another case number, Harold declared, his voice carrying across the assembled group. He was a man who chose to protect others, even at the cost of his own life. Like my daughter Emily, he saw that true justice means standing up for those who need it most. Maria Alvarez dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, nodding in agreement. Around her stood former residents of the streets, people who had known both Emily's kindness and Jack's presence in their darkest days. Bridget Hall from the shelter clasped her hands together, her face reflecting years of seeing both tragedy and redemption in her work. Jack died as he chose to live at the end, helping to expose crime and protect others, Harold continued. His sacrifice helped break open a network of exploitation that had haunted our streets for too long. The small crowd of journalists scribbled in their notepads. By evening, their stories would transform Jack Riker from a faceless convict into a complex hero who had found redemption. One reporter approached Maria afterward, capturing her quiet words. "This shows that everyone deserves a second chance, just like Emily always believed." Bridget Hall stepped forward to share her own perspective. "In our work at the shelter, we see how people can change when given the chance. Jack Riker proved that by following Emily's example, protecting others no matter the cost." After the formal remarks, Harold met with local advocates in a quiet corner of the park. He pulled out his checkbook, writing the first of what would be many donations to strengthen the shelter's programs. "We need better outreach, more beds, more counselors," he said firmly. "Everything Emily fought for will continue." Margaret and Daniel watched from beneath a nearby oak tree, seeing how Harold's stern judicial demeanor had softened into something warmer and more purposeful. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the grass as the small group discussed plans for expanding services and support for the homeless community. 3 years passed like gentle waves washing away old pain. Harold stood outside the freshly painted building, its new sign gleaming in the morning sun. Emily's Haven. The autumn breeze carried the scent of coffee and warm bread from the kitchen, where volunteers prepared breakfast for those in need. His fingers traced the bronze plaque by the entrance. The words caught the light. "In memory of Emily Calloway, who saw the best in everyone, and Jack Riker, who gave his life protecting others." Children's laughter drifted from the nearby playground, a sound that would have made Emily smile. "Good morning, Judge Calloway," called Sarah, one of the regular volunteers, as she carried in boxes of donated clothing. Though retired now, the title stuck with him. Harold smiled warmly, helping her with the door. Inside, Margaret and Daniel were already at work, carefully hanging framed photographs along the freshly painted walls. The images showed Emily in her element, distributing blankets, sharing meals, offering comfort to those society had forgotten. Each photo told a story of compassion that had inspired this place. "The police chief called this morning," Daniel said, adjusting a frame. "Santos's final appeal was denied. It's really over now." Harold nodded, feeling the weight of those years lifting. The trafficking ring that had claimed so many lives, including Emily's, was dismantled. Its leader would never harm another soul. Margaret stepped back from the wall of photos, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her eyes met Harold's with understanding and love. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. The distance that had once divided them had melted away, replaced by shared purpose and healing. As evening approached, Harold stepped outside alone. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. He pulled Emily's letter and the locket from his pocket, reading the familiar words one final time. His daughter's grace and forgiveness still moved him to tears. "Thank you," he whispered to the quiet air, thinking of Emily's brave heart and Jack's final sacrifice. The streetlights flickered on, casting warm pools of light along the sidewalk. In their gentle glow, Harold saw the promise of tomorrow, a legacy of kindness that would outlive them all. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Harold, Jack, and Emily, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.